On today's episode of Sleds I Almost Forgot I Owned, we take a stroll through the boneyard. Oh yeah! Now as you can see, this has been in a climate controlled storage unit. And I'm only being sort of sarcastic because this is a good tarp. Let's see if anything's living under here. Well, it was home to something. Well, that's just lovely. I picked this sled up many years ago for $100. Now that didn't come with an engine or any real drivetrain parts, no track. Came with most of a suspension that was taken out of it. So after years of being under that tarp, it sees the light of day once again. Luckily, plastic doesn't rust, I hope. And I'm really glad that the seat didn't get chewed up. Has some preservation dirt. It's definitely no showroom, example. I think it's missing a piece or two. Oh, at least the spare belt looks good. So we're going to call this thing the extra cheap Resurrection saving pennies. Well, there we go. A nice fine specimen of dust accumulation. And I guess it's not just dust. I mean, there's trees growing in the skis. I'm sure all of the mice that were hiding in there are now migrating out into my tools. I mean, I thank the groundhog for 6 more weeks of winter, but I could have done without his home remnants. Alright, we're going to uproot this tree.
I'm going to run a backhoe and uproot that tree.
Okay, so you're probably asking, what is the plan for this build? Oddly enough, I'm asking myself that same question. Now, I have been kind of scrounging up parts whenever I can find them over the past, well, good amount of years, actually. See? Hoarding pays off once again. And I finally accumulated enough parts to maybe get this thing back together. Now, it's a pretty cool sled, and something like this, could deserve a full-on restoration. However, this one is not in the most spectacular of condition. And I also don't quite have the motivation or wherewithal to do an actual restoration. So the next best thing is a preservation of sorts, or a restoration. That we are going to try and get this thing back in functional condition, give it a little bit of a fix-up and some care along the way, get it out from under its resting place beneath that tarp. Now the important parts like the engine and stuff that are kind of special to the SP, we're going to put those back into action to actually make it true to what it was when it was new. I'm really looking forward to, feeling what one of these 440s runs like. I've always heard about how they were a great performing 440. So this ought to be a good excuse to use up some of those old Polaris parts that are sitting out back. Yeah, getting this thing into some good, poor quality light really brings out the worst in it. I mean, I don't know what happened to that brake lever, if that got ground down on a road after it got flipped over, or what the heck happened there, but yeah, the brakes are seized solid, so we're not stopping there. Now, it looks like that seat cover was an aftermarket style. It doesn't have the 440 graphics or whatever that was on the back, but that is the nicest thing on this sled so far. So if that groundhog would have tore into it, I don't know if I'd have had enough motivation to continue. I'm really glad they put both keys on the same keychain. That way, if you lose one, you lose them both. Now, I'm assuming that those bars are not stock, but I got to do a little bit more research. She's got the black dash, so from what I've read, I mean, this does appear to be a true SP sled. Well, we're off to a good start. Oh, she's mint. Well, we've actually got a drive shaft, so that's a plus. Alright, now this is pretty cool. We've actually got the specs here for the EC45PL08 motor, which is the XP or SP motor for the 96. Now supposedly that chain case is magnesium and not aluminum. I must say the pine needle preservation method is strong in this one. Looks like the running board's been either cracked or broken or whatever, but she's been well repaired on. Maybe this thing was actually raced. Dude, this thing really has some pretty serious battle scars. I mean, there's dents and dings and torn up belly pans. I mean, it has the obligatory tree dent in the front bumper. You can see where this trailing arm got pushed the whole way back, and they've had to repair it with new rivets and stuff. I mean, this thing was actually either raced or, you know, a previous owner really liked to bar hop. The more I keep looking at this sled, the more damage I keep finding. There's pieces of hardware store aluminum just reinforcing the tunnel and bumper. All sorts of poorly welded aluminum repairs. Stuff is just cracked everywhere. So I got this beautiful example of an Indy 500 motor here for an amazing $30 or $35 for the whole box set. And that included a whole lot of the engine. And I just seen there's even a CDI down there. Still not sure if we're going to trust that oil injection or not. I'm going to save these for later. EC50PL17. Holy crap, that's a lot of revisions. And if you look closely, so we just got a box full of random parts. You know, most of that's off that Indy 500 motor. And we're going to clean this crankshaft up and put it back into service. Now, the motor that I got, it had burned down one side, and the other side looked like it was starting to get burnt down. The cylinders were just bored 20 over, and the pistons didn't look that old. So something catastrophic happened here. Well, before taking the bottom end apart, you know, everything looked solid. But sure enough, we took it apart, went to look things over, and a bad crank seal. So previous owner probably rebuilt it, put all new top end in it, burned her down in short order again. Always make sure you find the cause of the problem. Don't just fix the symptom. Got the bottom end going back together. Scrounged up some new old stock crank seals out of the pile. And it appears this is a 1999 or year 2000 500 liquid cooled bottom end. Time to start recycling all them parts. These gaskets, they're pre-crushed for high compression. It's going to be a small miracle if this head gasket seals. Since we're going to be rocking the stock Indy 500 CDI box, we just advanced the stator about a degree or two. Should be alright. You should always torque these flywheel bolts correctly. Click. Now this goes against everything in me, but we're going to put the oil injection back on, just for originality, I guess. Playing process of elimination with the remaining hardware. Well, now we've come to the point where we need a base gasket. And unfortunately, the one that we got is torn apart. Now, we should go out and actually buy a brand new one. But what's the phrase of the day? I ain't paying for that. We're going to make one. Now, I know it's not always economically feasible or desirable to have all your gaskets need cut, but being that most of my projects are impulse projects, I often don't have time. I don't want to wait around for gaskets to come in the mail. So 10 minutes with a razor blade and a set of scissors, and we'll have her cut. And this is also probably maybe 10 thousandths thicker than the original. I'm not really sure, but we'll just say that's increased port timing for performance. Now what you can do is hold the gasket firmly onto the base gasket, or the cylinder there, and you take a smooth blunt object and you kind of push around here and push down on the gasket and kind of etch the whole way around your cutting guide. Kind of hard to see on the camera, but you end up with a tracing there that you can use as a quick guide pattern. Trace it out with a pen or pencil if you want. Now you can either use a hole punch or a hole punch to put those in. You got to be careful sometimes using one of these on thicker gaskets. When you punch through and it's close to the edge, it can split it, and then you're starting over again. So I don't know if I mentioned this, but I bought this cylinder many years ago because it is the -08 which was in the 96 SP. So it's been sitting on the shelf for years just waiting. And when I got it, looked at it, looked pretty good. Nickel was in good shape. I thought she was ready to go. Unfortunately, upon closer inspection, you can actually see that there's been some corrosion and the pitting is showing up in the nickel coating. So this cylinder is not as mint as I thought it was going to be, and thus we're not going to spend the money to actually put like a new Wiseco top end in it. We're going to put the Used-Co top end in it. Well, here we go, giving everything the very precise fitment test, you know, seeing how much clearance you got there. Yeah, she feels about right. Move over to the SPI.
And that ain't right.
I don't think that's going to cut it. Now, I do like rock and roll, but not when there's that much in my cylinder. Now, I thought this was the good piston. Looks like an SPI. Says it's for a 440. It's got to be the wrong piston for this engine. Well, I think we found out maybe why the old top end didn't have much compression, whoever put this together. Well, that really sucks. I guess we're going to have to throw this thing back out underneath the pine tree until we can scrounge up a couple of pistons. I'm just kidding. We're not going to actually put it underneath of a pine tree. It's just going to sit out in the rain. Now the jets are not correct for this engine, but these 34s are off an Indy 500, and they're close, so good enough for our starting point. Well, time for some predictions. So since these carburetors were on a larger displacement engine, usually if you put carbs like that onto a smaller engine, you've got less displacement pulling air through, and thus maybe, you know, a slightly less vacuum signal as it's going through the carb. And that usually requires larger jets throughout to get your fuel mixture back where you need it. Now on these carbs, comparing the cutout on the slides, the needle jet, and the jet needles, or vice versa, these appear to be a bit leaner than what the factory specs call out on this sled. So we're going to watch it and see how bad it is. Now, apparently these things were jetted a bit rich from the factory, so we might be alright, but we may end up having a bit of a mid-range, you know, bog or some popping going on, and if that's the case, we'll have to get in here and reset this. But one thing to consider, unless you're fine-tuning and changing a needle, or your throttle cutout here, usually from the factory, this whole combo works pretty well together. So if you just swap one component in, it may, you know, not have a smooth transition throughout the throttle range for the fuel mixture. So before you go out and start spending a lot of money on hard parts, try it the way it is, get a feel for it, and then you can usually spend your money more accurately on what you need to replace. Well, believe it or not, I'm having trouble finding a clutch for this sled. I actually had one that I was halfway through rebuilding, and I seem to have lost it. So we got this dusty specimen out of the premium storage pile, and it appears to have the elusive blue spring, not to be confused with Bruce Springsteen. Well, there it is after a quick rebuild with the air gun. She looks about ready to run. Well, we might have to change out those flyweight bushings. Now, to go off on a slight tangent, a sled like this is right in between the area where it's something worth saving or something that should be parted out. And I know there's a bunch of people that are like, stuff should never be parted out. But unfortunately, in the life cycle of stuff, some things need to be parted out to keep other things going. So as an example on this project, there are rare parts that were kind of specialized to these sleds. The XCR 440 SPs, maybe a later year XCR 440 consumer model. You can't buy them new. Nobody makes them in the aftermarket. You have to buy them secondhand. In order to save one machine, other ones need to get parted out to supply the replacements. When something gets too rotted out, or maybe it's wrecked, or it just costs too much in repairs to economically bring it back into service, the parts can be worth more than the whole. Without a salvage industry, you wouldn't have a repair industry. So even though we're trying to put this thing back together pretty accurate to how all the specialty parts would have been, some things maybe just aren't going to be available or affordable. So it's going to be put back together in the spirit of the way it should be. Get the correct things where you can. Other places it may not be a factory spec restoration, but at least it's going to get it back on the trail. Now, one point of clarification on restoration. I'm not against showroom restorations and shiny paint and stuff like that, as long as that is what you're really after. I hate it when people get into projects that don't really meet their expectations or their wants. And that leaves people with either a really expensive paperweight that they don't want to use or drive, or they never get to the point of finishing it and just end up frustrated and having an empty wallet. You got to keep the end user in mind when you're doing a project, and that's usually yourself. You know, taking some shortcuts on a project sometimes allows you to actually finish it and get it to completion stage where you can use it and have fun with it. And that is nothing to be ashamed about. Anytime you can get a project to a next stage or actually enjoy it, that's a win in my book. So we accidentally spilled some oil onto the seat. Might as well give it the ATF restoration now. Now I could repair or replace this throttle lever, but that just adds character. So we're going to leave it.
4 to 6 weeks later.
So everything may look the same, but that's just because it's been on hold for like a month and a half. I mean, I really enjoy tripping over that ski every time I have to walk by the sled. This thing is starting to fall into the dreaded Project Purgatory mode, and we can't let that happen. Not sure if I mentioned this yet, but I am pretty sure the shocks are going to need rebuilt. However, I don't have the motivation or want to spend the money right now to rebuild them. We're going to wait until winter at the last minute and then rush everything to get them put back in. Because thinking about preventative maintenance is just as good as actually doing it, right? Now, you don't even want to know the amount of pain and suffering that we went through to get pistons for this thing. The first set I ordered, I don't know what happened, but the description, whatever I ordered them, they're not for this 440. They were for something else, way too small. Second set, I do the research, look online, get the pistons that are like, I think they're 66 or 68.25 millimeters. Says that in the description. Go to buy them, get them. Turns out the description is wrong and they were undersized. Wrong again. Had to go back, find new numbers, finally get these. I think they're right. They better be right. So we've had the bottom end in really good sealed storage. Definitely no dirt got in there. Even though they're cheap pistons, still got to check the ring end clearance. So we put the torque wrench on here to tighten up those base studs. Well, those might be parts unlimited pistons, but funds are limited, and we're reusing the gaskets. But don't worry, we cleaned everything up with a Scotch-Brite pad, so should be good as new. If you don't scrape off all the old corrosion and grime off your gasket surfaces, even if they are new, they won't work very well. So we're trying to do things right and use a minimal amount of RTV, which in this case will probably result in leaking and reapplying copious amounts later. So we wait until this point to finally put the oil injection barbs or posts or whatever the heck they're called, these things here on the banjo bolts, right? For once, I'm actually going to put oil injection back on an engine, do it the right way, and, try and make life easier. Well, since this is a Frankenstein motor, the impulse line is dead nuts right in line with where the oil injector's got to go. Yeah, that's not going to quite work. Now the only option would be to pull the bottom end apart, re-drill and tap a new barb off to the side somewhere a little bit lower for the impulse line, or just abandon the oil injection voodoo and do things the way Mother Nature intended. Ah, yeah. That feels better. So we'll fire up the CNC to make a fancy blocking plate. We cleaned that up really nice with a Scotch-Brite pad, and we got one of our scrap pieces of gasket that you don't throw away. That ought to be a perfect size. That problem solved. Now we just got to put these parts somewhere in a nice organized spot where we're never going to forget about them. So we put a bolt in here with Loctite, and we had to make a modified short bolt to actually fit in between the barb here up into there. Now, it almost looks like somebody hit on this thing with a brass drift and bent that a little bit, but I don't know who would chance that and chance cracking that barb. But anyways, that thing ought to not come out of there because it can't come out too far before it hits the hose and stops. So that color, that's where the extra horsepower comes from. Now, of all the things to break, it's the water pump drive pulley. Apparently it got rust and it blew out and cracked this or whatever, but I've scrapped I don't know how many of these because, well, what do you need those for? On old junk engines that were seized up and filled with water and yada yada. Well, it turns out I need one now and I don't have one. So we're just going to run it. Now, you may say that is going to put things slightly out of balance. Not if you're missing one of the original bolts and you just take off an extra washer and then you just sort of angle that on there and orient it so it counterbalances itself out and good to go. At least that's finished. Huh. Unfortunately, it didn't clean up itself underneath the hood. I can't remember if we took inventory on the parts we still needed or not. But if we did, I forgot about it, so we're going to start over again. It's going to need all new fuel lines and all the normal wear parts. But hey, we can get rid of that oil injection. Well, we've only got half the choke, so we're going to have to figure that one out. And all of the hoses appear to be missing for the coolant system, so we'll have to go find a parts sled to try and pirate all those off of. Looks like the perfect donor. Looks like most hoses are intact. And we might even get some cool handlebar extensions. So after losing some of the skin on the knuckles of my hand, we were able to liberate, well, most of the hoses that we're going to need for this thing. Not sure if this aluminum extension pipe was factory or not, but it's going to go back in. Now we also got the skid out of outside storage, and not surprisingly, some of the bearings are not sounding the healthiest. Oh, that one's good. We're going to reuse that, but going to go through, grease up what we can, replace bearings that we need to, and basically do the bare minimum to get this thing back in there. This track came from the miscellaneous pile of tracks, and it's not in terrible condition. Has a few tear outs here and there, but I don't believe there's anything major structurally wrong with it. We're not going to look too closely because we really don't want to find those spots anyways, but I think this is out of a 94 ZR 700. Yeah, don't tell the Polaris it's from a cat. I don't know what type of grease they put on here, but it has turned into like super glue. So while putting some new bearings on, we noticed some slight damage to the wheel here. I mean, just because it's completely severed through the rubber doesn't mean it's bad. We might have been able to get a few more miles out of that. Whew. These are the 6004 bearings, not the regular 6205s. I only got 3 new ones in stock, so luckily that's all the bad bearings we found. We're just going to have to ignore everything else.
4 to 6 weeks later.
If you want to see what something in Project Purgatory looks like, that's it. This thing has been sitting here, and I've been tripping over it for at least 2 months. And I've really ran out of motivation, and it's getting towards summer, and who wants to be working on a sled? But we need the floor space, so this thing's getting put back together. Been stealing hoses from all over the place, but of course the cooling system isn't going together very well because there's some specialty hoses needed, and we ain't gonna pay for that, so we're just hacking stuff together. We got the suspension wedged into there. Sometimes it's easier to just flip the whole sled up on its side and throw the suspension in that way, but we ran into a small problem with the motor mounts. They're the style that bolts from both sides, and as you can see, it goes through the tunnel right where the track is. And luckily, we just installed a track right in there. Now, the proper thing would be to spend the half hour, pull the track back out, and just tighten them bolts up real easy. However, we're not going to do that. We're going to spend 45 minutes the hard way trying to fish a nut up through there in between the nice and sharply studded track. That's got to be a leading cause of carpal tunnel. So we've got a problem. Our secondhand motor plate we got here doesn't quite line up with the bolt holes in the frame. I mean, 1993, 1996, that can't nothing change in 3 years. So a little bit of backstory. Of course, that was an eBay purchase because the original motor plate was long gone, and it was really cheap. 3 years difference, we took the gamble. Sometimes you come up snake eyes. Snake eyes! So as you can see, neither of the bottom bolt holes line up, and we have a pivot point for the steering that's in the way of that side. So there is the problem, pretty well laid out. Now, we were thinking about trying to, weld the wrong way some aluminum onto there. However, upon further inspection, we have a torque arm right there for the motor to keep this whole thing from rocking back too much. I think we can just punch an auxiliary motor mount right about there, take care of things the easy way. Now, this is a case where when you're trying to hack something together, factors like that extra torque arm up there really play into it. If we didn't have that, and you moved that mounting point, from over there down to here, you're losing a lot of the support and restraint that you need for what those motor mounts are doing. and it probably would not work very well. The motor would flex and would deflect, and your belt alignment would go all out of whack, and so on and so forth. But being that we know we're going to have that problem, and we have a potential solution to it, yeah, we can hack it now. Now here's a problem that we've been running into lately that shouldn't be a problem. I'm running out of parts. These Polaris secondaries were made forever, and I used to have a ton of them, to the point that I had to get rid of some. Couldn't even barely give them away. I mean, $5 or $10 at the swap meet, they wouldn't even sell. So eventually I got rid of the excess and only had maybe a half dozen extra. Sure enough, I've been on a run lately of needing these clutches, and we're out. So we grabbed this one that apparently was on the Centurion at one point, and we're trying to fix it up and get it working on this. Now when we threw the helix down in there, there was a bit of play all around it. Figured no big deal, probably got to get a new fiber bushing in there. Wrong. It ain't so much the bushing that's wore out, it's the seat all the way around. So this thing's been spinning in there and probably wearing out the aluminum and the outside of this bushing here. Now the still inside of it still fits tight onto the helix, so we just got to find a way to center and anchor this thing in there and get a few more 1,000 miles out of it. We got most of the crud cleaned out of the chain case, and the chain is kind of back useful again. So the plan is basically to run this chain for a little while and then change out that oil and get all the crud and rust out of it. So the brakes just weren't working, so we had to remove them and in the process break the hand warmer, but I'm sure that probably didn't work anyways. Now sure, I bet there's probably something in the parts yard that I could try and find, but it's not going to be much better than this, so why not try and rebuild it? I mean, if a mere mortal put this together, we can figure out how to take it apart. Well, now that we have a nice pile of parts here, and we sprayed everything with the old, penetrating miracle, we got it to actually move the piston here, and hopefully we got enough lubrication down in there to get things freed up. And we're going to call this a stage 1 rebuild. See, the sludge coming out of there tells you that the rebuild was successful. I can definitely appreciate the random washer thrown in here as an extra spacer to tighten up the brake lever. So I'm not a certified brake technician here, but the bleeder's frozen. The line going in is also frozen, so we've been bleeding through the brake light sensor. However, when you squeeze the brakes, I don't think that switch is supposed to be passed through. Now luckily we were able to source a high quality new old stock replacement part, and just like that we've got the world's most reliable brakes. So while checking the flexibility of the fuel line pickup, we lost a screwdriver down in there. Did I ever mention how much I like to go fishing? This is like playing the claw machine at the arcade. So the verdict on the old pickup line, it was bad. It's going to need replaced. However, this is where the real problem starts. That is really cracked. Somebody threaded that fitting way too far in there and split it open. Now we're going to have to try and salvage this clear tank. Sometimes it really makes you wonder what other things are wrong with a sled like this when it had been left for dead. And since we are at a point of no return, we have to fix it. So we barely got the pickup out of the tank before it started, disintegrating. So I'd say it was probably worth changing that. It's always a good sign when the brass is the same color as the fuel line. These little hose clamps that break off and have really sharp edges, they're really fun. The back side of your jeans is the most sterile place to clean a wound. We installed a hose clamp around that tank barb fitting and smothered it in some sealant, and we're going to hope it works. So after like the 8th time fitting that engine in there, maybe it's finally gone home.
Are you too good for your home?
So far it's holding antifreeze. I don't see anything leaking on the floor. We had to get a little bit creative with the exhaust because apparently somebody had swapped this over to a more standard type of single piece exhaust. Yeah, the old exhaust pipe was falling apart, so put a quality weld on it. Now I know what you're thinking. Why would you paint a perfectly good rusty exhaust? And, you know, to be honest, I was having a beer and I made a poor decision. Got the clutches all installed. Belt deflection's a little bit too tight, but we're just going to run it for now and see what happens. Found out that the air box, which I got out of the trash, ain't so much of a perfect fit. Turns out that this XCR motor's got the intakes down lower than on a normal Indy 500, so I guess we're going to run pod filters. So things are getting down towards the end, and we need some choke cables to get this beast started. However, we went and scavenged the scrap pile, and I cannot find a twin set of chokes. Apparently those are in high demand. But what we did find was a set for triples, and I've actually got a few of these laying around. We only need 2 out of 3. We'll just let the other one hang out there and call her good. Now we're going to load some partially pre-fouled plugs here into the plug caddy for future trail disappointment. A windshield might help eventually, along with some new grips, but that's just cosmetic details. That's pretty much it for now. We just need to add some fuel and try and fire it up. We've got other projects to worry about right now.
Many months later.
As time goes by and the snow threatens to fall, it's time to finally get back on some forgotten projects. And the old XCR actually has a list here of remaining items. The throttle managed to break itself just sitting over summer, so that's cool. However, the brakes that are hanging together with a wing and a prayer are still working, so we've got that going for us, which is nice. Now the cats have been slacking, and there are all sorts of remnants down there. We replaced the shoestring hold down with an actual cable, and a whole bunch of random springs are being employed to try and hold down this exhaust. Now, that might not have been a factory hole there, but it should have been. Here's one fairly substantial problem. We're missing the running board reinforcement down there. We had to take it off to get the VIN number off of it for registration. And like a year goes by and it just sort of disappeared. And there's the highest horsepower addition to the whole sled. I kind of want one of those old school headlight covers, but apparently they're bringing like way too much money these days. Now this is crazy, but we actually got a new thumb throttle with a heating pad in it. Fancy. I have to laugh that the new old stock really cheap hand warmers are the same brand that's coming off of these things. I think the overall theme of this sled needs to be late 90s ex-racer that was bought by some young kid that just kind of like riced it out. We might need some tacky decals, maybe some sled next logos, some neon pink somewhere. Definitely more checkered flags. We need to capture that point in time where this was just an X-race sled. It was not the newest thing on the block, wasn't really desirable. Not too many people wanted it except, racer wannabes out on the trail. And those sweet aftermarket handlebars and riser. I gotta find one of those purple or blue jewel things that goes in the taillight. This has kind of brought upon the idea of using only period correct decals for this era sled. We're gonna have to start scouring eBay for old school decals. I mean, this thing is already half trashed. We need it to be fully tacky. but in a 2001 Nickelback sort of way. It's got some war wounds and battle scars. Yeah, it's seen some things. No problem that the windshield's been replaced, because you know this thing has been wrecked before. Down to the final touches, and we've got about an inch of snow on the ground, so time to do some testing. Got to get these hand warmers stuck on there, and some new grips. Cheapest ones you could get off of Amazon. I don't know how well that's going to stick. This stuff is great for all sorts of jobs. Gonna have to cut down part of this grip. But hey, universally incorrect for the application. Good enough. Fuel is on. We've got it to the carbs. So the spark plug caps are worn out and they won't quite stay on. So instead of getting new ones, we're just going to hold them down with some gum bands. That's a factory race team secret. Well, we need just a little bit more snow to give it a good test run. That way we can dial in the clutches and check the carburetors, but so far, not running too bad. Definitely needs more ski pressure or some new carbides because it doesn't like to steer. And the shocks are in severe need of a rebuild or replacement, but that'll be for next season. So we're ending up here, needing to go back into the shop. Got to tweak the carburetors a bit, do a few more tuning things, swap out those skis, and then try and actually put some miles on it. So once again, we're giving this thing another once over for the third time, twice today. The skis have been upgraded to some old Ski-Doo skis. I think the red matches better. And we were able to scrounge up an old Indy 400 air box. Nothing like digging some parts out of the Arctic glacier. And it didn't quite fit. Had to egg out the holes and kind of move everything over a bit to get the carburetors in there right. The chain case oil had sort of turned to mud and rust. I mean, it's supposed to look like that, right? And the jetting was definitely a bit on the rich side. So we're going to go from 250s down to 230s up top and kind of tweak the air screws a little bit. Still have not found that running board support. I hope I didn't scrap that. Secondary's out, getting some tuning. Sled ran pretty decent, but something wasn't quite right. I think it was getting a little bit of over rev off the line. Now the stock helix was a 34 degrees. Well, let me take that back. The one that was in here was a 34 degrees. Stock helix was some other R8 or combination thereof of Polaris. Now, just happened to be going through one of the random boxes of clutch parts, and what do we have here? 440 XCR. Turns out we got a 50-36, and that's pretty dang close, I think, if not exactly what we was looking for. It always pays to hoard parts. This sled is getting the premium treatment. Even a brand new belt. So we're out in the middle of a, I don't know, 100+ mile ride, and you know, nothing can ever go smoothly, and apparently that bushing there decided it didn't want to be part of the clutch cover anymore. I'm just going to call that a governor, keep the clutch from fully closing, you know, keep our speeds down. So in order to make ourselves feel better but not really fix anything, we jammed the bushing back into the cover, and we have a zip tie strategically placed here as a stopper to try and keep this thing from migrating eastward. Is it going to work? Probably not, but it's going to make me feel better, and that's what counts, right? Drove about 30 miles back to the trailer with no external bushing. I'm sure the crankshaft was really liking that imbalance. So this bushing has a ridge around it that normally this part locates into the cover there, and the bottom part here is captured by the spring. Well, over time, it broke out like that. This stayed underneath of the spring, and this whole part of the bushing was able to move down here and let the cover just kind of move around. When it's all said and done, though, that XCR, that thing really met and exceeded my expectations for it. After replacing those skis, putting the new ones on with some fresh carbides, and kind of getting the suspension tweaked a bit, that may be one of the best sleds I've ridden in the twisties and in the woods. That thing just loves to carve, and the seat's very low, so not great for your lower back in the moguls, but you can lean off to the side, and man, you can just throw that thing around. And when the jetting's dialed in, sled moves pretty good too. At the moment, my old 1983 Indy with the extra wide ski stance is kind of off the trail getting some other maintenance work done. So the XCR took its place. Future plans are definitely going to include getting some shocks rebuilt on this thing. Also likely going to take that head off of there and remove some of the extra shims, which I initially thought were just gaskets. There's separate shims that raise up the domes to increase the compression a bit so you don't have to run premium fuel. Well, you always need more power. Scored these gaskets for 20 bucks shipped. Actually, no, take that back, like $13. Heck of a deal. Anyways, these are the shims that you don't need. And also, since we kind of used a slightly thicker base gasket, definitely don't need these, I think, even though we're still going to run premium fuel in it. So that's about it for this season. Going to drain some of the gas out of that sled and get it ready for summer storage. Overall, very happy with how it came out. It was a long project in going. Took almost a year. Well, definitely a year. Multiple years in the making, gathering all the parts up. And a lot of last minute eBay purchases to get parts that didn't know we needed. But that's how a project goes sometimes, and it was definitely worth it. Oh yeah, and we finally found that running board support.